I suppose the reason I came into that sphere was I was concerned with what Michel Foucault, I have to drop his name as much as possible, would call the main danger. When he talks about, I suppose, the interests, how we go about what we're doing in our day-to-day lives, he says, it's not that I believe everything is dangerous as a post-structuralist theorist, but he wants to attend to the main danger. And I think one of the things I was aware of in terms of disability, accessibility, these new publics where we know many great democratic claims have been made for, was that there was a slice of the population that was was physically excluded from some of that. So while some disabled groups can use Facebook and so forth, at that time, Facebook didn't have an accessibility team. If you were a blind user or a visually impaired user, you were being cut out of certain conversations. You literally couldn't get into the space. It was a walled garden. For people with intellectual disabilities, suddenly you've got issues around passwords, and again, the flow of information can be like a blur. There are all sorts of different challenges. So I suppose what this comes down to is me saying very early on, there's this question of who participates in social media prior to who participates in our social media research. And I appreciate everybody in this room, has a sense of who is in, who is not in the media that we're using. But to try and sensitise that in a really strong sense, we know, I think it's been quite interesting around the Cambridge Analytica issues for Facebook recently, that it seems when they've started to react, it's been on the basis of the New York Times coverage rather than, say, The Guardian or Channel 4 coverage. And there's that sense in which Facebook remains, to a certain extent, an American company rather than a global company. And although they've done a lot, obviously, with their languages, etc., I think there is still a strong argument in terms of Silicon Valley, etc., around what in disability studies we would call the normate user. So the normate was defined by Rosemary Garland Thompson as the kind of the centre. So for those of us from a postmodern perspective, the margin defines the centre. So if you say, here's our category of disability, the most contingent, the most contextual of categories, who is defined against that? So for Rosemary Garland Thompson, it's about saying, if we have the disabled other here, who's put at the centre? It's this able-bodied person, this kind of reified, let's say white, middle class, technologically literate, device-laden, Western European Anglophone user who's at the centre in some sense. And while they might not be named, they are there, this notion of the norm. So it's starting to sort of tease that apart. And really this moment has happened, but the extent to which we're still dealing with the aftermath of trying to tease apart this normate in the centre of who social media research is about is quite interesting to me. So I wanted to look at who is participating in social media, who is excluded, and then when we get into who participates in social media, there's a question of who participates at the next level in our research. So if we're already pulling on a pool of people that's pre-selected, what might our methods do to exclude certain groups that may be less visible within social media work? And Warren's already said there's this issue of counting and what counts, who counts, and of course for a lot of this big data research, the issue is we have the data, we have the data, therefore we use it. And again, I wanted to draw attention to the kind of the biopolitics of counting. So for those of you sort of from the more sort of social sciences, you'll maybe quite familiar with the term biopower. Again, Foucault uses biopower as a term to establish the ways in which we perceive ourselves that are created externally. So he, for example, identifies the rise of medicine, sort of in the 19th century, and the way in which we now see ourselves through a medical prism. So, we understand ourselves through a medical lens. And the rise of statistics, likewise. So prior to statistics, you had no idea how many of your neighbours owned a red hat. course, we don't know now how many of our neighbours own a red hat. But as numerical data becomes available to us, in some sense colonises us. So there's a sense in which the statistics of how many likes we have versus how many likes our friends have that positions us in a kind of a hierarchy of numbers, and we start to see ourselves through the metrics about how successful we are or how successful we are not. And so a lot of that happens in social media, and there's been a lot of really interesting writing about that. But what's also interesting is the way that it actually changes our understanding of our own bodies. So I was really wanting to get into the notion of social media and how it changes our understanding of our bodies relative to others, where we are in society, the extent to which do we understand social media to mediate difference, remediate and erase difference, or does it allow us to be more, I suppose, human and have a more diverse understanding of what it means to be human, etc., etc. Anyway, so I found sort of descriptions of disability difference at different levels. There's the accessibility issues, which might be about the tool, whether it's usable or not usable by a different range of people. There's the socio-technical stuff, so this stuff about the way in which, in use, a social media mediates what can be done, and with it compels us towards certain kinds of actions. So early days Facebook was very much about a kind of a performance, a positive performativity of the self. And so I interviewed some participants who suffered depression, significant depression, and the idea of trying to articulate or speak that self in this space where everybody is, you know, kite surfing or having a great time, pictures of parties abound, it's all very upbeat, was really challenging. And there's a sense in which they were silenced or had to be silenced. And then there's the kind of societal aspect, which is, you know, I suppose Berners-Lee talks about, you know, the web, all human life is there in a sense, where you see the discrimination that you might see on the street. You see disableism, ableism, and then the resistance to that. So those were sort of the places where I was noticing disability happening. And this demanded certain methods, because I was aware if I used the kind of, if I was scraping data or if I didn't have accessible methods, that I'd be locking certain people out of participating in my research. So some people who use the internet use assistive technologies to do so, and I needed to create a circumstance whereby I wasn't locking them out because I couldn't handle the technologies they were using at the same time. So to sort of handle that, I used what I would call over-shoulder methods. And this is a kind of bricolage of different things. So like remote desktop viewer, but being in the room at the same time with that person. So you can see what they see on screen as well as how the screen's being captured to your own laptop. And you know, the connectivity issues, trying to do that with mobile broadband back in 2009 was horrible. But anyway, the point is you're patching together this kind of unsystematic mix of technologies in what I would call a bricolage. And I think that's what a lot of us as social media researchers do from this kind of ethnographic side. We grab technologies that will work and we make something happen. And there's a creativity in that, the work around, the kind of hacker spirit, which I think is really positive. But it has to be light on its feet for all the reasons Richard's already mentioned. We know these systems change. We know what we can do is difficult. So for example, one of the labs at Nottingham where I was working previously, they did some really interesting stuff where they were gathering what was happening on people's iPhones, and they cracked the iPhones to do it, and then people could edit films of their own activity, and then the researchers would collect that, and it was a real kind of, again, over-the-shoulder look, and your participants had some control, but of course trying cracking an iPhone to that end nowadays is actually impossible. So we have these windows and we kind of climb through them. We take what we can and we do what we can, and then we climb back out again. So here's an example of some of the interesting things that came up for me in terms of silence. Here's a silence. So not their real names, but this is a little moment from Facebook. Jane Smith writes, "Nothing on your wall. Outrageous, how are you?" And Claire responds, "Thanks for writing on the wall I didn't even know I had. I can't wait to see your kitten," etc. I presented a paper at CSUN about this and had interesting conversations with Facebook about it, because this is almost a moment of social accessibility. One person, Claire, who had multiple disabilities, couldn't perceive the wall that everybody else was using to kind of express themselves at that moment in Facebook. And Jane raises this. She sees the silence and she interprets it, and then she gives the sort of the key to the kingdom to her friend by showing this space. And this was back when Facebook used to give you an email to say, something's happened on your Facebook profile, and you click and it would go straight to that moment. And that was a really useful tool for some disabled users at that time, because it took you straight to the moment activity, and then you could deal with it, and then you could leave again. Because I'm going to show you a screen grab from what Facebook looked like for Claire at this moment. And this is what she was kind of faced with. So, and this I find interesting, because all the Cambridge Analytica stuff, all the scraping that they do and so on, they can whisper in your ear, but they can't necessarily see this kind of thing. This is a real user perspective on what's going on. So this student, she had a very large desktop, 32-inch, so a large TV. She got particular drivers set up for very high contrast, as you can see, and Facebook couldn't handle it. So you can see the overlapping of the different buttons. When she tried to see a drop menu, if the live feed was rolling, she couldn't sort of perceive what was there. A lot of disabled students at this time would use the mobile interface rather than the desktop interface, because the desktop interface was just kind of a blur. And she was highly technologically literate, this student. You know, she really knew her stuff, and the sort of the different technological interventions she had set up to handle the technology was, you know, so this really was inaccessible at this time. It wasn't any deficit on her account. So I wanted to sort of raise flags about the nature of who is doing what. I haven't touched on the kind of global dynamics of what disability is, despite the sort of nature of accessibility standards interacting, I think, in different ways with local cultures and local understandings of what disability is, local experiences of what disability is. But I wanted to raise a flag to look at some of the normatively dubious but potentially difficult to perceive aspects of what we're doing with social media research. Okay, and that's the end of what I have to say.